Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, March 13th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about President Biden and his pathway to re-election and how it actually is a bit easier to see than you otherwise might think when you take a look at our 2024 general election polls. Now, the national numbers are, of course, a very important indicator about the current state of the nation, where some of these states are, where the national figure is, where America is on this presidential election. But given that we are faced with the same exact candidates from the last election, we are given a lot more information than we normally have in a traditional presidential election. And a rematch election is one that is a lot less likely than we otherwise might think. Historically speaking, a rematch election just hasn't happened since 1956, and so for a long time, we've had different contenders in presidential races. This time, it's different. And in the last election, we have numbers to base our upcoming election prediction on, alongside many, many other factors. This is the third time that Donald Trump will appear on the ballot this election, third time that we will see Donald Trump as the GOP nominee, Joe Biden's second time being on the ballot, and the fourth time on a presidential ballot, obviously as Vice President Biden. And so looking at this, we have two institutional candidates, both of which have served out one term as President of the United States, now facing up against each other in a sequel rematch election. And so with that being said, there's a lot of conversation around what are the pathways to President Biden and President Trump's reelection. And given that the most recent numbers today show President Trump with leads in almost every single swing state, the question is now, what is Biden's path of least resistance? What is the way that Biden ends up back in the White House if he's losing in all of these races? Now, I will say that I am somebody who often puts a lot of weight in polling data. Not everything. I don't think they dictate the way that the country goes to a T. We know that from electoral history. But what we also recognize, too, is that there is some validity in the way that these polls move forward. But coming off of an election like 2022, coming off of an election like the off-year ones we saw in 2023, and special elections in between that time frame, we have seen the polls, in many cases, underestimate Democrats. And so with that being said, I wanted to show you the pathway to President Biden's reelection and why I genuinely believe there is a much higher chance at victory than what the pundits might be telling you. Because although the national numbers aren't great and nowhere near what they were back in 2020 or quite frankly even 2016, what we learned in 2022 is that the conventional wisdom that Democrats need a majority of the popular vote, or plurality even of the popular vote, to win the national vote would be a necessary component of winning the Electoral College, of winning swing states. That has now been thrown out the window. When Republicans won the national vote by 3 points in 2022 but lost Pennsylvania by 5, it completely rewired the way that we look at things, that pundits look at things. But now that we're in for a rematch, I think we're reverting back to where we were in 2020 and assuming that this is the same exact race, meaning the polls must also be equally as off as they were back in 2020. And genuinely, I don't see it that way. And there's a number of reasons for why that is. Now, this video isn't an election prediction. This video is about Biden's pathway to re-election and how we could reasonably see it without major concern through the map that I will show you in just a few moments. And I think the purpose of this too is to show that President Biden actually doesn't need that much in order to win the election. I think this sort of puts things into perspective as well about how Hillary Clinton failed to win the election in 2016, despite having a lot of, the electoral math in her favor, the polls in her favor, the fundraising numbers in her favor. I mean, generally speaking, the 2016 election was absolutely a winnable election for Secretary Clinton. In the same way that the 2024 election is a, somewhat easier election to win for President Biden if he just maintains a little bit of what he got back in 2020 and potentially giving some up to Donald Trump. But when I take a look at this map here, I think it is evident that President Biden absolutely has a pathway to re-election. Even when we look at some of these numbers, it may seem as if it's a done deal. If these were the numbers back in 2020, based on the way they were off, President Trump would have had a landslide of an election. But things change between elections. The polls certainly did, and for the first time, as I said, in 2022 that we had seen in years, the polls actually underestimated Democrats. Do I think the polls are underestimating President Biden right now? Absolutely. Do I think he would lose the state of Nevada today by 7.7%? The answer is absolutely not. Do I think he would lose a state like Arizona by 5.5% today? The answer is absolutely not. While I do think there are voters out there that are displeased with Biden's handling of international conflicts or domestic policy as it relates to immigration and healthcare and other issues that matter to voters, absolutely, there are voters out there that are disapproving of the way that President Biden has been handling the job of President of the United States. And you can see this in President Biden's job approval rating. Negative 15.6% nationwide. Less than 40% of Americans strongly or overall approve of the job that Joe Biden is doing. A 15.6% difference between disapprove and approve. And yet the numbers here only show President Biden losing some of these states by margins that would be impressive, but nowhere near match what the president's approval rating is nationwide. Which is a large reason as to why, looking back at 2022, I think we very much estimated Republicans to do quite well. Midterm elections are almost always referendums against incumbent presidents, but 2022 was just simply not that. And President Biden's approval rating back in November of 2022 was honestly not that much better. Going into the election, right on election day, President Biden had a disapproval rating, an overall net disapproval of around 12 to 13 points. At the peak of the summer, President Biden was overall at net negative 20, the worst point ever in his presidency, and Democrats went on months later to win in almost every single competitive Senate and gubernatorial race. It was fascinating to see, but again, put things back into perspective, that the way that we see President Biden and his job approval rating does not always dictate the way that the nation might vote. But President Biden's pathway to victory would rely heavily on him doing well in a lot of the states that Hillary Clinton did well in 2016 and that Joe Biden did well in 2020. States like Minnesota, where he won by 8, or won by 7.2. In New Hampshire, where he won by 8. In Colorado, where they won by 13.5. In New Mexico, where they won by 10.1. In Virginia, where they won by 10.1. These states that were pivotal in President Biden's election back in 2020 would equally need to be here for President Biden again in 2024. On the point of New Hampshire and Nevada, both of which have voted for Democrats in the past 4 election cycles. Nevada and New Hampshire last went red, New Hampshire in 2000 and Nevada in 2004. And so for a while, these states, although being swing states, have been consistently out of reach for Republicans. And in order for President Biden to win, he would need to tap into that same exact base that he had in the last election. And I don't think that's too much to ask for. Now, Nevada and Maine and New Hampshire are also states that I think I would have shared, or not Maine. Maine's 2nd district I would have talked about a little bit more. But New Hampshire and Nevada are of unique points of interest to me because the polling here doesn't really show the same exact thing, despite me characterizing them at the same exact time. When you're looking at Nevada, President Biden loses here to Donald Trump by 7.7%. In the state of New Hampshire, they don't even have it here as a battleground state because President Biden is leading by the exact same amount as he did in 2020, around 7 points. Now, what I do think is that there are differences in population. Demographics are different, income levels are different, regions are different, and electoral history is absolutely different. But again, states that Hillary Clinton won in 2016, and she won Nevada more than she won in the state of New Hampshire, which again might be surprising to note today, but is a guiding factor that has led me to believe that these 2 states at default do well for Democrats, even if the polls don't immediately suggest it. Will Biden have to fight for it in this scenario? Absolutely. But that isn't to say that he isn't fighting for many of the other states that I'm about to give to President Trump for the sake of this video and for the sake of showing you the pathway of least resistance for President Biden. He's not going to be through some of these states like Texas or Florida. Well, the Democrats might be spending some money there. Now, for states where President Biden actually isn't investing as much as you might think, I just showed you how the Biden super PAC is planning $250 million when it comes down to the Labor Day to election battleground state blitz in terms of ad spending. Texas and Florida actually aren't grouped into that. The investments are in all states that President Biden won, with the exception of North Carolina, and I think that's fair. So with that being said, it brings Donald Trump to 218, President Biden to 231, and 89 remaining toss-up electoral votes to determine the pathway forward for President Biden. So, where does this happen? Well, given historical trends, Maine's 2nd district is going to go red. Nebraska's 2nd district is going to go blue. And so they sort of equalize each other out. But now we're at a point where Biden is exactly where Secretary Clinton was back in 2016. Donald Trump is at 219 electoral votes. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona. All states that Trump won in 2016, Biden won 5 out of the 6 in 2020. And so where does he go from here? And I think the obvious answer is the Rust Belt. When I look at a state like North Carolina, and a state like Georgia, and a state like Arizona, I'm not here to entirely believe what the polls are telling us, but I do think they are good indicators about how much they have shifted away from President Biden relative to the last election. When we look at the Rust Belt, the numbers are a lot better for Democrats there. And the good news for them is that because their numbers are looking better there, the Trump campaign is starting to focus on these states as well. Instead of believing that this is going to be a cakewalk victory, the Trump campaign is now investing money in states where President Biden is still maintaining a lead in. But it means that the resources, that if the Rust Belt was truly gone, and going back to Donald Trump the way it was in 2016, the investment in other states would have proved to be more beneficial for the Trump campaign. But now both of these campaigns, dueling campaigns, are looking to win in the states that they have both won before. And the Rust Belt now seems to be at the center of it again. But Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina, my real reasoning too as to why I didn't characterize these states immediately as ones that we would find President Biden having a surprise pathway to victory is because I think they're a lot less likely to go blue than some of the states in the North. For instance, in North Carolina, this is similar to the Republican Party's Nevada, but it comes so close and yet so far for the Democratic Party. In Arizona, President Biden only won the state by 0.27% in the last election. Today, Donald Trump leads by 5.5. In the state of Georgia, the numbers aren't better for President Biden. Donald Trump leads by 5.7%, and that number is awfully close to a majority compared to many other states, including the ones we just characterized, like Arizona, right? Like these states where you do have North Carolina even, where it's closer, but not as close as Georgia. This is why this is not in my pathway to Biden's reelection. Does he have the ability to win these states? Absolutely. They're by no means written off as unable to go to President Biden. But it looks like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, based on polling data, election history, 2022 performance, is the pathway here for President Biden with the amount of least resistance. Looking at Wisconsin, Trump leads by 1 point. Michigan, Trump leads by 3.6, but Trump is at 46%. In the state of Pennsylvania, Biden leads by around a point. Not at a majority, sure. Not doing as well, but neither is President Trump. And so when I take a look at these numbers, there are clear differences in the margins, in the expectations, in what we are seeing in terms of fundraising and electoral history that are screaming out and saying that Biden can win on the Clinton states alone with Nebraska second and the blue wall staying blue. Which means, honestly speaking, this pathway to re-election is a lot more likely than we think. These states at default are not conservative. North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona are. When faced up with a traditional Republican, Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona eat that up. They love it. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania don't. All three of the states have Democratic governors. Michigan, Pennsylvania now have Democratic advantages in the state legislature. In some cases, like Michigan, Republicans had maintained one chamber of either the governorship or the state house or the state senate for the past 40 years. The first Democratic trifecta ushered in under President Biden's failing approval rating and lackluster numbers that ended up with strong Democratic performances. Michigan, Pennsylvania both have Democratic senators, both positions filled. Wisconsin is split. The House delegations here are, despite gerrymandering, still strong enough for Democrats for us to reason that they are the party that wins here at default, not Republicans. The same cannot be said across those Sunbelt states. Well, President Biden put together a winning coalition that spanned the entirety of the United States. It was clear where there were preferences for President Biden more than in other states, like Pennsylvania, where he won by 1.2, like Michigan, where he won by 2.8. When I look at these narrow margins in Georgia and Arizona and North Carolina, they tell me exactly what I need to know, that Biden can win without them, and that pathway is very, very obvious. In this circumstance, which I think is more likely than we think, President Biden would win 276 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 262.
As we move forward towards the election, it will be interesting to see if states like Georgia and North Carolina and Arizona are polling the way they are today. In 4 or 5 months from now, the entirety of the Biden campaign might shift gears. Because unfortunately for President Trump, Democrats now know where his weaknesses lie. Suburban regions, inner cities, and Democrats know where they benefit the most from that, and historically have had strong grips on some of these more ancestral Democratic voters in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There is a pathway forward here for Democrats. The question is, does Biden take advantage of that? Do Democrats do well down ballot enough to carry Biden over the finish line? Only time will tell, but I'm fascinated to see how Donald Trump tries to crack this and win back the presidency, and if he will succeed or not. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.